Okay, so Brazilian slavery is kind of our topic for discussion here. So Brazilian slavery kind of started, and it's a part of the transatlantic slave trade that happened around 1400 era. And so the slavery in Brazil, it's kind of really covered up by the transatlantic slave trade in total, because when people think of the transatlantic slave trade, they involve Europe and North America. And this is kind of a misconception because over 40% of all slaves that were trafficked in the transatlantic slave trade or the triangle slave trade went to Brazil, and it is about 10 times more people were sent to Brazil than America alone. And in Brazil, these slaves were treated a lot worse, but not really touched on as much in our history as well. And not a lot of people know what actually happened in Brazil with these slaves. So here in this picture, you can see that these slaves were treated very poorly, and they were often beaten um, up to 9 days at a time. It also said in one of the readings that we had that and this is a quote from it. It says, "Whipping for nine successive days in ordinary punishment. They fastened to a cart, and they receives 200 to 300 lashes, mangled flesh, then cut out, cayenne pepper and salt put into the wounds to prevent the kind of corruption and disease to spread." And this was also carried out by other Africans that owned these slaves as well. This was not just Europeans that owned these people, but the main people who really started this kind of brutal nature towards these slaves were the Portugal. And they started because whenever they came to Africa, they were never really intended to do slaves and trade slaves. They first were looking for gold and silver and other minerals, but ended up starting the slave trade, and they kind of did this by bribery and bribed these slaves and sometimes forced these slaves into working. And they also had other um, people that were head over some of the larger tribes in Africa to own slaves and run some of their plantations as well, because Brazil was really known for their sugar and their large tobacco fields as well that they had to work in. And here's some of the questions that we had along with our readings. As describe the common punishment in Brazil. Like I said before in the common one, it says several days of whipping to the point that the skin would peel back, and they would cut it off and put pepper and seasoning inside to stop the sickness and the disease to spread. And this also touches light again on how brutal they were to these Brazilian slaves. And it kind of makes us look back and think of how our slaves were treated in America to how these were, and it kind of makes us want to put more light onto the Brazilian slave trade. And second question here is, why would a slave owner not want a slave to be exposed to religion? But during that time, slaves were held to a lower standard, so these people didn't want these slaves to be a part of religion because they believed that only free men deserve religion, not slaves, and they held them to a lot lower standards than the regular common people. And the third question is, after reading both paragraphs, does it appear that slaves were helpless individuals? They were not entirely helpless, but they were treated as such in Brazil. And then it says, explain the connections to the author makes to the present state of Brazil and the fundamental feudal times in Europe. This connection there, it pretty much shows how much of a lasting impact that the Europeans had on Brazil, and how much that is still affecting today. Like in Brazil, they still have a strong African culture that is showed there, and this is kind of because of the Europeans and what they did. And these are two more pictures that kind of shows that how these European people, they were very, very high wealthy, and they held these auctions for people. And on the right side, it shows how brutal they often treated these slaves. And Brazil now, in the video that we watched, that showed that the culture now still revolves around some of the old teachings during the slave trade there. And in this, you can see the fighting and dancing style that was shown in the video, and talks about how that this is a way of them to, I guess, learn self-defense and kind of fight back for themselves. And this is where the, I guess, them being helpless comes into play. They were not entirely helpless. They had their own forms of self-defense, and they also use this as a time to, I guess, practice their religion, but in a secret kind of way.